On the day his father planned to announce him as heir to the entire Kobayashi clan, Hayato Kobayashi stood in front of every senior lieutenant the organization had and said the one sentence nobody expected to hear. He refused the throne completely, and he refused to explain why. Subscribe and stay until the end, because the reason behind his refusal was buried in a decision made 10 years earlier that nobody inside that room had ever fully understood. Goro Kobayashi had spent 35 years building one of the most respected criminal empires along the western coastline, an organization known less for brutality than for the kind of disciplined precision that made rivals think twice before testing its boundaries. For the past decade, every lieutenant inside the organization had assumed Hayato, his only son, would eventually inherit everything his father built, a succession so widely anticipated that few inside the clan had ever seriously entertained an alternative. Hayato had spent those same 10 years training, learning, proving himself capable of leadership through countless demonstrations of strategic thinking that impressed even the clan's most skeptical senior advisors, men who rarely extended praise easily to anyone, including the boss's own son. By every visible measure, he was exactly the successor his father had always intended to create, which made his refusal, delivered calmly in front of the entire assembled leadership during what was meant to be a celebration, feel less like a decision and more like a confession nobody yet understood. "I won't take the throne," Hayato said, his voice steady despite the visible shock spreading through the room. "I'm grateful for everything my father has taught me, but I can't accept this position, and I won't explain why in front of everyone gathered here." Goro's expression remained carefully neutral in front of his lieutenants, though something behind his eyes suggested this refusal carried weight beyond simple surprise. He dismissed the gathering shortly afterward, requesting a private conversation with his son that several senior advisors later described as the most tense exchange they had ever witnessed between the two men. What was said inside that private meeting remained between father and son for nearly a week, until rumors began circulating that something connected to an incident a decade earlier had resurfaced, something involving a young woman named Emiko, whose name few inside the organization had heard mentioned in years. Emiko Saito had been Hayato's closest friend throughout childhood, the daughter of a mid-level lieutenant who had served Goro loyally for over 15 years, a man whose quiet competence had earned him respect, rarely extended openly inside an organization built on hierarchy and careful distance. When Hayato was 19 and Emiko 17, their friendship had begun shifting into something neither of them fully acknowledged at the time, the kind of quiet affection that exists in the space before either person finds the courage to name it. 10 years ago, during a territorial negotiation that turned violent without warning, Emiko's father was killed in an ambush orchestrated by a rival organization seeking to destabilize Kobayashi leadership during a vulnerable transition period. The attack also severely wounded several other lieutenants, and in the chaos that followed, decisions were made that the clan rarely discussed afterward. Hayato, only 19 at the time, and desperate to prove himself capable of protecting the organization his father had built, had identified the rival lieutenant believed responsible for orchestrating the ambush. Acting without his father's explicit authorization, he led a retaliatory strike that resulted in the death of 3 men, an action that effectively ended the territorial dispute, but came at a cost nobody anticipated. One of the men killed during that retaliation was Emiko's older brother, who had unknowingly been present at the rival organization's compound for reasons entirely unrelated to the ambush that killed his father. Hayato had not known. There had been no way for him to know, given the chaotic intelligence available during a retaliation launched within hours of his own father figure's murder. But the outcome remained the same, regardless of intention. In avenging one death, he had inadvertently caused another, destroying the family of the woman he cared for most, in a single violent night neither of them ever fully recovered from. Emiko learned the truth 3 days after the attack, when clan intelligence confirmed her brother's presence at the rival compound. She never publicly blamed Hayato. She understood even then that he had acted on incomplete information during chaos nobody could have navigated perfectly. But something inside their relationship fractured permanently that night, a wound neither of them ever found language adequate enough to address directly. Emiko left the organization's territory within months, relocating to a city several hours away, severing contact with almost everyone connected to her former life, including Hayato, who never attempted to follow her despite the guilt that had quietly shaped every major decision he made throughout the following decade. For 10 years, Hayato carried that guilt in silence, training relentlessly, proving himself through achievement after achievement that none of the senior lieutenants realized was partially fueled by a need to justify a death he had never intended and could never undo. The announcement of his succession arrived precisely when Goro decided the clan needed certainty about its future leadership, a decision made without full awareness of the conversation his son had been quietly having with himself for an entire decade about whether he deserved the position at all. 3 weeks before the formal announcement, Hayato received a letter that changed everything. Emiko had written to him directly for the first time in 10 years, informing him that she had recently learned new information about the night her father and brother died, information that complicated the straightforward narrative both of them had carried for an entire decade. According to documents Emiko had uncovered while settling her late mother's estate, the rival lieutenant responsible for orchestrating the original ambush had deliberately positioned her brother at the compound that night, using him as bait specifically designed to provoke exactly the kind of retaliatory strike Hayato eventually led. In other words, her brother's death was never an accidental casualty of Hayato's retaliation. It was the intended outcome of a calculated trap designed by the rival organization to maximize the devastation inflicted on both families simultaneously, ensuring that whatever retaliation followed the initial ambush would also destroy the relationship between Hayato and Emiko as collateral damage in a far larger strategic objective neither of them had ever suspected existed. The revelation arrived too late to prevent 10 years of guilt, but it arrived in time to fundamentally alter how Hayato understood the decision he was about to make regarding his father's throne. He could not simply accept leadership of an organization built partially on a tragedy he had spent a decade believing was entirely his fault, not without first understanding whether the truth changed anything about his fitness to lead people who deserved a leader operating from clarity rather than buried guilt. This was the reason behind his refusal, though explaining it publicly meant exposing details about Emiko's family tragedy that he was not prepared to share in front of an entire room of lieutenants who had never known the full story behind an incident the clan had quietly stopped discussing years earlier. Goro, once Hayato finally explained everything during their private conversation, understood immediately why his son had refused the throne so abruptly. Though he disagreed entirely with his son's underlying assumption, his expression carrying the particular weight of a man recognizing a manipulation he himself had never thought to question. "You've spent 10 years punishing yourself for a death orchestrated specifically to manipulate you into exactly this kind of self-doubt," Goro said. "The rival organization that planned this knew you well enough to predict you would carry guilt indefinitely. That's not weakness, Hayato. But refusing leadership now means letting their manipulation succeed 10 years after the men responsible are already dead." Hayato considered his father's perspective carefully, though the weight of a decade's guilt did not simply dissolve through logical argument alone. "Even if the trap was designed to manipulate me, the outcome remained the same. Emiko's brother still died because of an action I took. And if you had not retaliated that night, do you believe the rival organization would have simply stopped attacking this clan?" Goro asked. "You were 19, operating with incomplete information during an attack that killed people you loved. The trap worked precisely because you cared enough to act decisively. That capacity for decisive action under pressure is exactly what leadership requires." The conversation left Hayato with clarity he had lacked for 10 years, but clarity alone did not resolve the deeper question of whether Emiko deserved to hear this truth before he made any decision about his own future, given how directly her family's tragedy connected to everything currently being decided. He traveled to the city where Emiko now lived, uncertain whether she would agree to see him. After a decade of silence neither of them had ever fully addressed, she agreed to meet him, though the conversation that followed carried none of the easy familiarity that had once defined their friendship. 10 years of unspoken grief stood between them, made more complicated by the new information neither of them had fully processed before this exact moment. I spent 10 years believing I destroyed your family through my own recklessness, Hayato told her, watching her carefully for any reaction. I need you to know that I'm not telling you this to ask for forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the full truth before I make any decision about what comes next in my own life. Emiko absorbed the revelation slowly, the same documents that had upended Hayato's decade of guilt now reshaping her own understanding of a tragedy she had spent 10 years quietly carrying without fully realizing the scope of manipulation behind it. They used both of us, she finally said, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone processing grief that had just become more complicated rather than less. Your guilt, my grief. All of it was designed from the beginning to create exactly this kind of permanent damage between us. I'm not asking you to forgive what happened, Hayato said. I'm asking whether knowing the truth changes anything about how you've carried this for 10 years. Emiko considered the question for a long time before answering. It doesn't undo what happened, but it means I don't have to keep believing the person I cared about most destroyed my family through carelessness. That matters more than I expected it to. Their conversation did not resolve into anything resembling the relationship they once shared. 10 years of separation and grief, too significant to simply dissolve through a single difficult conversation. But it created something neither of them had possessed before, the possibility of eventually rebuilding something honest, built on truth rather than unspoken guilt, neither of them had ever fully voiced aloud. Hayato returned to his father's territory 3 days later, prepared to make a decision that finally accounted for everything he now understood about the manipulation behind a decade of guilt he had carried largely alone. He requested a second gathering of senior lieutenants, the same room where he had refused leadership weeks earlier, though this time his expression carried none of the uncertainty that had defined his initial refusal. 3 weeks ago, I refused this position because I believed I was unfit to lead people who deserved someone operating from clarity rather than guilt, Hayato said, addressing the assembled leadership directly. I've since learned that the guilt I carried was deliberately engineered by enemies who understood exactly how to manipulate me into permanent self-doubt. I won't let their strategy succeed 10 years after they're already gone. Goro watched his son with quiet pride as Hayato formally accepted the succession he had once refused, understanding that the version of his son standing before the clan now carried a different kind of strength than the one who had walked away weeks earlier. Strength built on confronting difficult truth, rather than simply burying guilt beneath achievement, a distinction Goro himself had taken decades longer to fully understand in his own life. 6 months later, Hayato Kobayashi led the organization his father built with a clarity that had been entirely absent during the decade he spent unknowingly serving as an unwitting victim of manipulation designed to destabilize him permanently. His relationship with Emiko remained complicated, built slowly across careful conversations, neither of them rushed, but it existed now on honest foundation rather than the silent guilt that had separated them for 10 years. And Hayato understood something his father had spent 35 years learning through experience, that the most dangerous wounds inflicted by rivals were rarely the ones visible immediately after violence ended. They were the quiet, lasting damage designed to fester for years, manipulating decisions made long after the original architects of that damage had already disappeared from the story entirely, leaving only the consequences behind to do their work in silence. The throne he had once refused became, in the end, something he claimed not despite the guilt he had carried for a decade, but because he finally understood exactly how that guilt had been weaponized against him from the very beginning.